Okay, thanks everyone. Don't get too comfortable up there because I am hoping we can walk our plots. So the sun's coming out a little bit, it's a little drier, so we are going to do that. So my name is Ashley Wagenaar. I'm with Farming Smarter since February. My background is I had the pleasure of working with Dan Oliver, who you guys heard from this morning, for a few years with Norterra here in Alberta as well as in Ontario. And then I also have done some potato work with the Little Potato Company. That's the actual name, but they also grow little potatoes, so it works both ways. So more of a specialty crop kind of side. And then here with Farming Smarter, I'm working with a group called Farm Resilience Mentorship Program, along with Rob Dunn. And we are just trying to support anyone who's interested in some different on-farm research projects that work underneath the cover cropping, nitrogen management kind of umbrellas. So that's what we're doing. And I'll let Theirry introduce himself quick, and then I'll go into it. Or do you want me to just go? No, introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Theirry. I moved to Canada about 3 years ago. I'm originally from Holland, where I grew up. And I have a background in geology and biology. So I'm kind of new to some of the agricultural sort of systems, but I've been getting a crash course from Ken and everybody at Farming Smarter to kind of get me up to speed as quickly as possible. I'm the research scientist here, so I work on a lot of proposals and developing some of the ideas and the projects that we're working into, where it starts with an idea just by talking to you guys, and then we develop that bit by bit into like fully fledged proposals where we can test something and get some nice, significant results, hopefully most of the time. I'll let you.
Yeah, and then I'll just kind of introduce what we're doing here. Theirry and I were going to do a little bit of joint on some of the things that Farming Smarter is working on, and then some of the kind of general ideas that cover cropping maybe as a specific to Southern Alberta system. So when we were talking at lunchtime, we were like, what if we call it our critical cover crop contemplation time? So we are expecting a little bit of what's the word, like from you guys. We want you to also talk with us. So I'm going to break the ice and ask if you were to give me a one-sentence definition of what is a cover crop. Just one sentence. You got to do it. So if anyone has an answer to that, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to pick someone. So, all right. Yeah. Do what? Yes. Tough. Yes. What else? Anyone? Something different than your cash crop. Yes. Thank you. Something you don't intend to harvest. So that's like a really interesting point, because certain definitions will say you can't harvest it, and then there are some definitions where they're like, not for grain, but if you're silaging it or you're grazing it, then that's allowed. So just depending, it's kind of funny, but if you're trying to get research money or some input in some way like that, what you end up doing with your cover crop can actually matter, and it can be different. So that's really interesting. But yeah. Anyone else? Are we good? Yes, nutrient cycling. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, kind of generally, it's a crop that's covering your soil when your soil would have been bare, really. So you're kind of creating, maybe a little bit more of a perennial system. So a system that has not just an annual crop, but a continuous crop of roots that are living and in the soil and like supporting those microbiome a little bit more. So that, that's kind of a general idea. And then however you're, like Jonathan talked about this morning when he talked about soil health and how complicated soil health can be, it's the same thing. Cover crops, extremely complicated, and it depends on what you're going to use your cover crop for. So your definition is kind of, what is your end goal with your cover crop? So I'm going to just kind of go through a couple of definitions quick before Theirry gets into some of our saving soils projects that we're doing here. Just on certain definitions that you might have heard in the literature, and some different, like, we're getting into cover cropping in some cover cropping research, and it's getting a little bit more specific and a little bit more well known. So we're kind of separating out some definitions. So if I was to ask you, what is a nurse crop? Does anyone know what a nurse crop is? Yes?
If you were trying to establish grass and you see some durum, what is a nurse crop to help protect it from major erosion?
Yeah, exactly. It's a crop that you're seeding before, and it's helping you nurse out a crop. We see it in canola a lot, seed canola. People will put in barley to prevent some of that wind erosion in their early canola. We also see it in establishing perennial grass systems, something to help those perennials come up a little bit better that way. What about catch crops? Money. Catch the money or lose the money? Catch crop, the idea behind a catch crop is it's kind of catching the nutrients. So like Jared said, it's catching what you have and it's holding on to it until it can be used by your next crop instead of losing it through the atmosphere or into your soil. Smother crops. We'll go two more. Smother. I mean, it's very, what happens when you smother something. You're trying to kill something, so you're trying to smother out weeds. You're trying to keep the competition, the living competition, and not allow any weed escapes is what a smother crop is. And then the last one we're going to talk about is a relay crop. Does anyone know what a relay crop is? Yes, exactly. It's a crop, let's say a couple of examples of a relay crop is you plant some canola and then you plant alfalfa after you plant your canola, but not before you harvest it. And then you harvest your canola and you let your alfalfa continue to grow, and then you can cut it and continue to use it into the next year. So that's kind of an idea of a relay crop. So, yes? I would say no, probably just based on the intention of what you're using it for, because usually you're not taking your nurse crop to any sort of, you're spraying it out. So you're using it just to help your crop get established, and then you get rid of it. So it's not increasing any competition for the crop that your main crop. Yeah. So Terry's going to talk a little bit about our Saving Soils project, and then we'll go into this fabulous little field demo that we have for you afterwards.
Yeah, I would like to also add a little bit about, what are the uses of cover crops.
Yeah.
This morning we heard a little bit about aggregate stability, which has to do with both the root structure as well as some of the microbial biomass that's underneath the surface of the ground. That could have quite beneficial effects. So it both can create large pores and small pores. So it can both help with water percolation, draining through into the lower bits of the soil, as well as the water holding capacity of the soil. And it just depends on our type of ground. Now, a lot of cover crop research has kind of focused on more humid regions where there's, extensive benefits from having cover cropping systems. So in Europe, as well in eastern Canada, there are definitely some advantages to it. While out here, where we have this sort of moisture, not really deficit, but we don't have a lot of it, things become a bit more complicated. So we have been working on the Saving Soils project since 2022. So that was funded by the RBC Tech for Nature as well as the Western Family Foundation Soil Health Initiative. So we're looking at how cover crops can improve soil health, and in particular, given our strong winds, nice timing, a lot of topsoil can be blown away. So if you don't have anything to hold your soil in place, it just gets blown away. Now you can make things as complicated as you want. You can just leave your stubble there and it'll hold most of the soil, but you can also plant some cover crops. So for example, fall rye, winter wheat, winter oats. We've done some studies with that and shown that it can actually increase the amount of soil that you hold. So that raises a lot of questions, like when should we plant our cover crops, how dense should we plant our cover crops, and what are maybe some of the negative effects of the cover crops as well. I don't want to compare it to a weed, but there are some similarities. Any crop you put in the ground is going to take up some nutrient, it's going to take up some water from the soil, and you might have less in the spring season when you put your new crops in, and you'll all of a sudden have to add fertilizer. So we've been looking at ways to terminate cover crops that maybe helps to put some of those nutrients back in the ground again. So I don't know who was here last year during the roller crimper demo, where we created some living mulch, where some of the stems are basically crushed, and that stops the plant from growing. So some of the results that came out of our Saving Soils trials indicated that, again, timing can be very critical, because if you try to terminate your cover crop at the wrong time, they might not terminate as well as you like, and they might even come up again, and they start hampering your actual crops. If you do it properly, they might create a nice residue on top of your soil and help both protect your seedlings from wind erosion, as well as maybe adding some of the nutrients back into the soil again as that cover crop terminates. So one of the things that we dealt with is using a herbicide to terminate your cover crop. So even though that roller crimper is an amazing machine and works very well, but sometimes you have to make that choice. Is it better to just terminate it chemically rather than with a physical machine? So just to kind of throw some numbers out, we tested, for example, fall rye and winter oats, which both showed very good establishment in the fall season. But if we then look at how well do they survive across winter, we noticed that, I guess this is maybe more common knowledge now, that fall rye has a much better recovery after that winter period. So if we had maybe a plant density of 200 to 250 plants in the fall, during springtime, the fall rye kept most of those, so that at 175 plants per square per square meter. No, that's not the right number. Yeah. Per square meter. While the winter oats only had 30 plants. So we've kind of moved away from using winter oats, and we're looking more into winter wheat, which is where we are right now. So talked a bit about living mulch. So what are the benefits of cover crops? So this is where things become a bit complicated, and we can see a lot of regional variation and seasonal variation. So we did notice an increase of about 30% in yields when comparing cover crops versus living mulch. So in that case, the living mulch actually had a beneficial effect on the yield, while if we looked at that same trial, the canola and the corn had a negative effect on the yield. So it very much depends on the crop where you're planting it. So both of these are under irrigated conditions. I think maybe the point that I should get across is maybe similar to what Jonathan talked about as well, where a lot of these soil health benefits, such as soil aggregate stability, carbon sequestration, might be a bigger sort of option the further on we go. In Europe, things are changing maybe ahead of things over here. But some of these soil health indicators may take up to 10 years to show any long-term effects. So recently, well, 3 years ago, a study came out by Frank Larney at the Research Center, which indicated that if you have a complete conservation agricultural management practice, so that includes minimal or no-till cover cropping, maybe some perennials in your cover crops as well, it can take up to 11 years before you see any beneficial effect on your yields. This creates a little bit of a problem for us at Farming Smarter, because most of our research projects are 3 years. So we are not usually in the time frame to see a consistent change in some of those parameters, but it's something to think about. So we talked a little bit about immediate effects, which would be, for example, the wind protection. There are some studies to suggest that by having a higher biodiversity and maybe even planting specific types of crops, you can have some pest protection as well. Where, for example, if you have, this is a study that took place in New Brunswick, and we actually had a speaker from Prince Edward Island recently as well, where they planted mustard in the field, followed by potatoes, and by incorporating some of that mustard back into the soil, you add some biofumigants in there, and the pressure from your wireworms could be less as well. So there's lots of things you could do with cover crops, and it just depends on your questions.
Yeah.
Does that set us up for the next bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
What we're looking at here. And we're Southern Alberta. We're dry. Who said it yesterday? Was it Brian Barris said we're farming water? So we're dry and we have a short season. So when we're talking about cover crops, a lot of this stuff isn't applicable here, or it's hard. It's hard to establish stuff in the fall. So we're like, what would be a cool idea or something different that we could show today that might be something that might be a little bit more applicable? And then we thought of hail. So we're like, it's not if you get hail on one of your fields, it's when you get hail on one of your fields. And then what could cover crops, could it be an option for, not a solution, but an opportunity for you to not think about that field as much or not have as many issues with it. So we actually have here at Farming Smarter a great little hail simulator. If you want to look over here, we have this attaches to a tractor and a barrel that spins. It has chains attached just to one side, and it just it just spins, and we run it over top of the winter wheat here. This is what it used to look like 2 weeks ago. So we hail simulated it out. And then what we did is we direct planted into it, as well as we just kind of lightly disked it and then planted into it. So we have 4 different types of crops that we planted here. We have canola as kind of a brassica option. We did, what's this?
Sorghum.
Oh yeah, sorghum. We did oats, and we did winter wheat. And so we didn't spray out these plots because, peas. Yeah, thank you. Winter wheat. We didn't spray them out. We kind of wanted to do the things that maybe we wouldn't want you to do, so you could kind of see what happens. So we tried to hail out these plots to max hail. Like if an insurance adjuster came by, they would say, this is a complete crop loss. And so we're like, well, if we don't spray it out, we want to see how much regrowth we would have. We want to see how much of a pain it would be to deal with. So if you guys are interested to come out and kind of see which ones are actually growing, we could have a quick look here. As you can tell, based on from where you are, our oats are very successful and our other crops are just not quite there yet. So we'll start over here. Come on out, walk on the plots. See the difference here between what we have just a disc, and then this is a direct seed over here. Worked once, yes.
So these were hailed
These were
just
hailed
over 2 weeks?
just over 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
This all got killed off pretty good.
Yeah.
We weren't that dead last week. So the cultivation did enough to break it up.
It did,
Plus the
yeah. The cultivation did kill most of the winter wheat. However, you can see like we were dealing with a lot of lumps and not an ideal seed bed for planting into. But if you look really closely, you can find some sorghum. Oh, that's it. What is our... The green one, yeah. Yeah, and it's a great example of some of our other crops are struggling, and our oats look amazing. And then, and then here we did our, our direct seed.
When it comes to some of the cover crops, but what about allelopathy? So rye,
Yeah.
yeah, and then like the radish thing on potatoes makes complete sense because the rhizosphere is toxic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, so we got a great question on the alleliopathy of cover crops. And yeah, there's some, doesn't look so good. There's some interesting information on, you know, a crop, if you're not super familiar with what alleliopathy is, it's a crop's roots extruding what other chemicals?
Yeah.
That stop other plants from growing around it to try and prevent competition, right? So there's some research out there that shows certain covers or just regular crops have more allelopathy than other plants, which would be fall rye and some of your brassicas. But we're also finding some people aren't finding as much of an issue with those.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's ongoing research.
I guess it's one of the advantages of a cover crop that by having something on the ground that's creating a canopy, it'll also has the potential to kind of help with some of the weed suppression as well. So again, if we're comparing it to fallow, you're definitely going to have advantages, not just from your soil erosion, but by having crops growing there and blocking weeds from coming up, especially if you have something that's very competitive early in the season, while so there's, and it just depends on what you want out of your cover crop. I guess that's.
So with the
What is-
tendencies with fall rye and stuff, though, most of the guys, it seems like they're planting canola or mustard the following spring after that. But if I have a customer that planted some barley after fall rye this year, and the rye volunteered really bad, like the field was a mat, they didn't get in there in time, and the barley has looked like crap all year. And I was kind of reading on it, and like I think the allelopathic the residual in the soil lasts for about a month, from what I understand. But it looked like shit for a month, and then it was better after that.
Yeah, so that's a very good question.
Can you summarize the question a bit first?
Oh yeah, so
mic?
so the question is if you plant barley.
Yeah, what would be the best crop after a fall rye?
Yeah, so what would be the best crop after a cover crop, which is fall rye? So in the case of fall rye and barley, you're both planting cereals, so maybe cereal on cereal could have an effect. So I think it's a very good point to raise that your cover crops should fit in your general rotation as well. While if you have, I don't know, cereals and canola, that seems to work amazingly well most of the time. So that might be a stronger effect. Interestingly, so here we planted our oats directly into the winter wheat cover crop, and they seem to be doing really well. So maybe that's because it's still within the same year. We haven't had like a full year of building up microbes and everything associated with the winter wheat. We just had like a little bit of a season, especially since our winter is fairly intense. So all of those things kind of interact, which is why it's so complicated to deal with cover crops.
Like we did stuff out in university at U of S where we did labs where we germinated fall rye with alfalfa or peas or canola or whatever, and it was amazing like how much it would actually kill the seeds, like how much mortality you would get from it. It was
Just a full rye.
It was
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, we're a big fan of full rye.
It's cool.
We're a big fan. Sometimes.
So we're kind of having some discussions just on fall rye, and fall rye is kind of becoming one of those crops that you talk about as a potential cover because of its aggressiveness to germinate, its ability to create biomass, and then there are the concerns that it also is a prolific weed if you can't get it under control, as well as sometimes we've talked to some bean growers who actually find it to have too much biomass, where it's too much to work up the next year, and they would rather not use it. And then an interesting example of a farm that I'm working with this year, they actually, in potatoes, they broadcasted on fall rye in the fall, and then they hilled their potatoes, and they let the fall rye germinate, and then this spring they didn't work it, they planted potatoes directly into fall rye at around a 4-leaf stage, and which some research shows is where like kind of the max alleliopathic effects of a fall rye is. And they're, so far, it's early in the season, but they're not seeing any difference in their emergence of their potatoes, and seems to be doing really well. So yeah, different types of crops probably have different effects, such as the barley that we were just talking about. So yeah, there's some interesting research and projects coming out. But then yeah, there's a perfect crop that's great, and then it has all of these problems. So there's never a perfect answer. And yeah, that's kind of what we wanted to demonstrate here, if that makes sense.
In that circumstance, did they just terminate by hilling, or how did they get rid of it?
Yes, they just terminated by hilling, and then they were going to use their in-season herbicide as like a regrowth termination for any regrowth. Yeah. Yeah.
I should say as well that the Saving Soils project is ongoing, so we basically only had 1 year of data, so even if those numbers seem quite high, it'll might average out over time. And you know, with this year, with the amount of moisture that we're getting, things might change a lot compared to our previous year and a half that we had. So it'd be interesting to see how a very dry year compares to a normal year. Let's call it a normal year.
I don't know if you guys saw on that team chat, but we have a site in Barrens that got some hail last week. And actually in that Saving Soils trial, the team that went out there saw that all of our stuff with the intercrops or the living mulch in it didn't have the hail damage, because the living mulch actually basically protected it from the hail. So that's kind of one thing we
Yeah.
never expected to see.
Yeah. Yeah, Trevor was saying the pea was basically stripped of all its leaves. Was it pea? Yeah. Or was it bee? Beans, sorry, yeah.
Of all the leaves, the ones that were out in like a plot like that,
Yeah.
and everything that had the cover is still has all its foliage. So
For
mitigation, I guess.
yeah. Did everybody hear that, or?
Yeah, and then, oh man, I just had a train of thought. I'm curious, we have some agronomists here in some farms, and I was curious about the most unique or an interesting cover crop that you've come across a farm maybe using a system you've never seen before. For example, that fall rye on potato one, that's one that none of us had ever heard of before, and the farm was like, oh yeah, we just thought we'd try it. And it's like, oh, okay, that's awesome. So if anyone has an interesting story to share, we were kind of hoping we could make a little bit of discussion about that.
I can start one off, which
Go
isn't
for
maybe
it.
necessarily a cover crop itself, but I recently came across a study in Italy where they used flamethrowers to kill their cover crop, because in Europe the herbicide regulation is becoming stricter and stricter, less inputs in general. And I don't know what the price of propane is these days. They use the flamethrower to terminate their cover crop as an alternative, because again, cover crops can be very vigorous, and if you don't have a way to terminate them or you miss your timing, you could be in trouble for your main crop.
There is, I actually worked with an organic sweet corn farmer near Hayes that used a propane burner for weed control. So it is around here a little bit. Yeah.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
Talk to your insurer.
Yeah.
Any other examples of interesting cover crops? Crazy cover crops?
If you seed canola, you see the cover crop, you get less, if you seed barley or wheat, you get less flea beetles, looks like it. Last year, I saw that the last 2 times when we did that.
Yeah, possibly something similar this year, where we had some canola that was interrowed with fall rye, and even though the fall rye was mostly terminated, it did seem to create a little bit of a buffer for the canola, and the canola that was grown within there, as opposed to the one that was grown with winter wheat. The one in the fall rye had a little bit more cover because the canopy was a bit taller, and we think that there's maybe a little bit less flea beetle damage, but it's difficult to quantify that. I think that's our theory as well, but it's,
That in its own is worth looking at, because flea beetles are getting pretty nasty around here.
That's why.
Yeah. I was talking with Hector Carcamo, and his latest crazy project idea was to create a vacuum for flea beetles. but maybe we'll switch to cover crops. Be a little easier.
Vacuum up the cover crop.
So I was just, Alberta Pulse Growers has a trial, so it's an intercrop trial with peas and canola, which isn't fashionable as a cover crop, but pretty dramatic differences between the mono canola and the piola in terms of like very few flea beetles. I mean, they're certainly within the context when you have a choice, you know, within a 25-acre area, they're right on the mono canola and they're not hardly bothering the piola. So that was kind of interesting to see. Of course, we didn't have flea beetles last year in the first year of the trial, but this year there's a lot of flea beetles and they're certainly liking the mono canola more than the mixed stem. So probably similar with the barley, I think. So. And U of A is actually monitoring that this year, so they're pretty tickled to see that the bugs are there. And they're obviously able to see those differences. So. Both are treated, yes. Yes, both were treated with an insecticide, completely legal, which U of A would rather not, but the farmer, you know, was using his regular practice there, so that would be, of course, for canola.
Is anybody just like letting the weeds grow and just chem fallowing it and being like, oh well, mow it down to this high and call it a cover crop? And I only ask because occasionally we do stuff into chem fallow, and it turns out like the plots after are great, right? So in terms of a cover crop, if it's not productive or whatever reasons, hail or whatever.
Yeah, I did talk to an organic farmer who just lets the volunteers, like whatever his volunteers of that year, lets that grow into the winter and then would kill that, and says that works really well for them as a cover.
So no post harvest, they just kind of let everything
Yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah. And then yeah. Or did you want to talk about the? Yeah, so coming from like a processing background where we're beholden to the customers and the customer requirements, we see more and more attention on the farming practices of the contracted farms, and we don't see that in the industry going away. So that's just another area where cover crops are becoming kind of more widely used, is to satisfy some of the requirements. And for example, with Dan's company at Norterra Foods, one of our the big food customers is Cisco, and Cisco has an extremely involved sustainability audit that the agriculture departments at each plant has to go through, and they have to go to farms and they have to go through practices, and they get scored on what's happening, and if their score isn't high enough, then Cisco won't be a customer of theirs anymore. So then there's also this requirement kind of coming from the other side of the industry. And then I'm sure you guys have heard the buzzword of the past couple of years, regenerative agriculture. It's another one of those keeping living roots in the system, and it's being really pushed by some of the processors like McCain's, for example, on how do we grow in a more regenerative way with a crop such as potatoes that is quite destructive. So we actually have some examples of the regenerative framework that McCain's has come up with, and they actually have some very in-depth rankings of what farms do and the practices. And though it isn't tied to a requirement now, most of the processors, they see in the future that if you don't fall into certain categories, you probably won't get contracts. So they see it coming, and that's why the investment is there on trying to get some of these late season fall crops established, because they see and they don't want to lose their contracts. So that's another side of the regenerative soil health, is maybe coming from the other side. Yeah. At the moment, no. But do they think that there might be like a premium to a premium regenerative products? That maybe. Now, no.
As a producer, my costs are going to go up.
Yep.
It's going to be a requirement that my costs go up.
Yep.
My top line is going to go up.
Yep. They do negotiate every year, so maybe that comes into the negotiations. Or I could see from a processor side, they say, well, then you just don't get a contract as well. So there is that side of it. But I'm sure the process or the negotiating power of the group would hopefully build that cost in, because it's more costly and it's more intensive and it takes a lot more work as well. So yeah.
But the end user typically doesn't pay for it, right?
Yeah.
So if you're at a
Yeah.
quick service restaurant, you're not paying more for your fries because you probably don't even know how they were grown.
Yeah.
So the processors they can't pass that cost on.
Well, and you think of canned and frozen vegetables, like those are not high margins there. So, yeah. So come grab a little example of it. It's kind of interesting just to see what they've chosen to rank. And they're doing this throughout the world. So this isn't just Alberta. This is every McCain's plant throughout the entire world. And we have to wrap it up here. So you can ask us questions back to the bus or back to the cart. And right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.